May the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Let's start, almost at least, at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. When you sin, you begin with, well, a very familiar story from the book of Genesis. A story that tries to give form and narrative, a kind of shape that we can engage with, to the question of how we can reconcile God's goodness and the intended goodness of all creation with human fault. A story that's probing the origins of our inheritance of lies and violence and betrayal, of lust and envy and blame, all of which follow in the next couple of chapters of Genesis. A story that seeks out the roots of human disobedience towards God, or of the first seeds, perhaps sown, of human wisdom also, and self-knowledge that somehow divides us one from each other and one from God. The story right at the heart of the book of Genesis is a myth in this truest sense, meaning that it explores imaginatively and through character and narrative a search for meaning in our lives today. And we know the story well. But today, what strikes a shocking blow to me is its depiction of the human response to God's presence and to God's call at the heart of the garden to Adam, to the man who was formed of the red clay of the earth. God's there. God is present in the heart of his creation. And God calls and questions the one he has made and the one he has given life, and the one he has given a gift of his Spirit in giving him life. And the human response is to do violence to another. To blame the woman, to blame the snake, to deny fault, and to betray the rest of the created world. The man's response is to live in half lies and the dishonest passing off of blame to others. And that creates, in the story, a divine penalty. This penalty is imposed for all these half lies and ends up in the passing on of pain to generation upon generation of the seed of woman. These come out of a new self-awareness within the story that Adam gains through eating from the tree of which he was forbidden to eat. A new awareness of vulnerability, and actually it's very appropriate that he becomes aware in the first moments of the story of his nakedness. And he becomes aware of his vulnerability, and he becomes aware of the risk to him of death. It's almost as though Adam's fearful and selfish response to God's presence and God's questioning is rooted in that understanding of his own vulnerability, in that desire to escape punishment to which he suddenly realizes he is vulnerable. To pretend that he is not at fault, to pretend that he is not the one who is vulnerable to God's presence, and to defend his own innocence, even if that too is pretended, even though he is losing its privilege at the expense of his blame of others. The crucifixion is perhaps the supreme example of human vulnerability, taking something of a model from Adam's own nakedness, for it almost certainly would have occurred with Jesus Christ, naked and ashamed and vulnerable and hurt and filled with pain. And yet, it was not something hidden from God's eyes. It was shared with the divine without any shame at all. It was done in this way so that all the violence of the world and all the vulnerability of the human race could be placed openly in God's sight. And to be crucified in weakness meant that Jesus embodied human vulnerability at its most vulnerable level. He was a strong man, our strong man, who was willing to be bound, willing to give up all his strength in suffering, willing to do all this so that we who are witnesses of his resurrection, and we who participate in a shared hope too in that resurrection, that we'll be raised and transformed as he is, can be weak in him. If we realize that, and if we enter into that awareness and acceptance of our vulnerability as humans, we're starting to move towards our very end being right at the beginning of the human story. That's a good place to start, and also a good place to return toward. In our resurrection hope, we return to this great mythic theme of all creation's eternal intended goodness and value being held in God's sight, being elevated by the presence of God within it, being changed and transformed by God's call to it. In a very famous sermon, C.S. Lewis talked, spinning fairy tales and yarns out of this new and restored hope of old creation. And he did that in 1942, at the height of the Second World War, when all hope really seemed to have gone out of the world. That sermon, The Weight of Glory, was preached in Oxford, and it described God's glory lying hidden from wisdom, hidden from goodness, hidden within clay jars, as Paul goes on to say in his second letter to the Corinthians, and hidden in people who seem everyday and ordinary and perhaps even ugly and unappealing, but who, if we could see them as God does, if we could think of them as God does in their potential, we would come to believe were like gods and goddesses and fairy powers walking among us. More practically, beyond this sense that creation had a weight of glory and a beauty that God was calling out of it through the resurrection, C.S. Lewis also described the realization that he had experienced, that we could be seen as God as a really important, loved part of his creation. Beyond those things which layer upon layer build up on top of our true humanity as revealed in the goodness of Jesus Christ. Things like divisiveness and shame and deceit. C.S. Lewis said that an awareness of this deeper reality of human existence underneath layers of grime can slowly be strengthened, so that myths and self-delusions can all be transformed into a full-hearted, full-throated belief that we can be delighted in and can delight in the presence of God. However we decide and believe that we are divided from others, however we need to cover up the source of our vulnerability or our shame from their sight, however we want to mistreat them and exploit them and lie to them and hurt them, the goodness of God's creation is seen by God in the face of Jesus Christ. And it can be seen also in his image in us also. It can be seen in love, in participation in the life of Christ, in vulnerability, in participation in his crucifixion, in the awareness of our potential to share in his glory, in the hope of his resurrection. And in all those things, we find our ending, back at the beginning of all things, responding in a garden that's growing and flourishing to God's presence and to his call.